On June 25, 1950, a surprise attack on South Korea by North Korea took place. Communists and capitalists clashed to take control of the Korean peninsula, and the war was ignited. Millions of people died in the war between 1950 and 1953, and Korea was permanently divided into North and South. Let's take a look and examine together why Korea is divided. The division of a nation cannot be expressed by borderlines alone. This situation concerns an entire nation. It means dividing a people, culture, and language that have lived together for centuries. Centuries before the partition, the Korean peninsula was a single unified Korea, ruled by dynastic kingdoms for generations. Invaded by Japan after the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, Korea remained under Japanese colonial rule for 35 years, until the end of World War II, when its division into two nations began. Japan was on the verge of surrender in 1945, and the USSR was advancing through Korea, crushing the Japanese army when news of Japan's surrender broke out. At that point, the United States didn't have a base in Korea and feared a complete takeover of the peninsula by Soviet forces. The absence of US troops was mainly due to a miscalculation of when Japan would surrender, to restrict the USSR from taking over the entire peninsula. The US proposed a temporary partition of the Korean peninsula between the US and the USSR. The fate of Korea was in the hands of the United States and the USSR as the Second World War ended and the Allied powers began to tear apart the Japanese Empire. In other words, only these two states could decide what would happen to Korea. Former allies didn't trust each other. In 1948, they formed two separate Korean nations, separated by a border at the 38th parallel, the line of the latitude that runs through the peninsula, to control each other's influence. North Korea became a socialist state led by Kim Il-sung and backed by the USSR, while South Korea became a capitalist state led by Syngman Rhee and backed by the US. While Soviet policies were immensely popular with a large portion of the working and peasant populace of the north, most middle-class Koreans fled south of the 28th parallel, where the majority of the Korean population lives today. In addition, it is reported that the US-backed regime in the south openly supported anti-communist right-wing elements. In 1948, the United States called for a United Nations-sponsored vote for all Koreans to determine the future of the peninsula. After the north side refused to join, the south side formed its own government in Seoul, led by a powerful anti-communist Syngman Rhee. In the north, ex-communist Kim Il-sung was appointed as the first prime minister of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The United States pressured the newly created United Nations Security Council to authorize the use of force to aid South Korea, and President Harry Truman dedicated troops to the cause without the approval of Congress, which has the power to declare war. This is the first time the United States has entered a large-scale external conflict without a formal declaration of war. The United States has assumed that the war would be won quickly, but that thought was soon proven wrong. In mid-1950, the northern side, supported by the Soviet Union, had the opportunity to unite the entire peninsula under communist rule and launch an offensive. The southern side was completely occupied by the Northern Army in a period of 3 to 4 months. However, the United Nations gathered troops from about 15 countries and managed to catch up with the South as reinforcements. However, there was another problem that China also announced its support for the North side and things got mixed up. By the summer of 1951, the troops were in a dangerous stalemate around the 38th parallel. The injured were traded. Negotiations began in July, but both sides vacillated at the negotiating table over the fate of the posts. Although many posts captured by American forces didn't want to return to their home countries. Both Korea and China insisted on their repatriation as a condition of peace. During a tense series of prisoners exchanged prior to the 1953 armistice, more than 75,000 communist prisoners were extradited. More than 22,000 sought asylum. On July 27, 1953, North Korea, China, and United States signed a ceasefire agreement. South Korea, however, opposed the partition of Korea and didn't agree to ceasefire or sign a formal peace treaty. So, while the war was over, technically the war never ended. It is still unclear how many people died in the Korean War. About 40,000 American soldiers and an estimated 46,000 South Korean soldiers were killed. Casualties were even higher in the north, where an estimated 215,000 North Korean soldiers and 400,000 Chinese soldiers were died. But the vast majority of those killed, about 70%, were civilians. As many as 4 million civilians are thought to have been killed, and North Korea in particular was destroyed by bombing and chemical weapons. At the end of the war, many soldiers were not heard from. About 80,000 South Korean soldiers were captured in North Korea when the war ended, although the North refused to take them prisoners. Deserters and South Korean officials reported that the trapped soldiers were forced into labor. The whereabouts of the remains of many of these posts will never be known. But in June 2020, the United States identified and extradited 147 South Korean posts, whose remains were handed over by North Korea in 2018. Meanwhile, more than 7,500 US soldiers are still missing. The results of the war can be briefly explained as follows. South and North Korea followed significantly different social, economic, and political paths following the end of the war. In the Korean War in 1953, the 38th parallel marks the so-called demilitarized zone that forms the border of the two countries. Economists find it difficult to analyze the North Korean economy because the data is either unavailable or unreliable. However, its authoritarian communist regime keeps economic output stagnant and outdated. Meanwhile, South Korea's economy is currently one of the most developed and productive in the world. As a result, neither the moves planned by the superpowers nor the devastating Korean War can reunite Korea. Today, North Korea and South Korea are not only separated politically and geographically. Almost 7 decades of separation have transformed them into separate worlds. South Korea is among the trillion-dollar economies, while the North's population still survives on aid. The two nations have different citizen rights, laws and order, economies, societies, and daily life. But thousands of years of Korean history as a united nation will always be a reminder of his arbitrary division. What do you think about war in general? What kind of consequences does the separation of Korea have for both countries? And who is more profitable? Please don't forget to give your opinion in the comments section. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video to see you in new content. Thanks for watching.